Presenting the Super Mega Awesome Castle shirt, which brings this episode of Shadiversity to you. Unlike the regular castle shirt, the Super Mega Awesome Castle shirt reveals why castles are so awesome in all their glory. Specifically, all those parts of a castle that were engineered to kill people. Kill people? That's a bit rough, isn't it? Well, if they're going to try and take our castles by force, you're damn well right we're going to kill them! Or taunt them mercilessly from the castle walls.
Your mother was a hamster and your father smelt of elderberries.
The Super Mega Awesome Castle shirt presents the name and visual image of the castle's outwards constituent parts. Specifically, the towers, keep, donjon, turrets, merlons, crenellations, crenelle, ramparts, baileys, matriculations! Murder holes, arrow loops, drawbridge, gatehouse, barbican, and the portcullis. Reveal to everyone why castles are awesome with your very own Super Mega Awesome Castle shirt, available through Teespring, link in the description.
Now go away or I shall taunt you a second time.
Shadiversity.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and what would you say if I told you that there is a type of castle more prominent and prevalent in history than the castles we see surviving today? And when I say that, I'm referring to the large, big, impressive stone structures, the tall and majestic, imposing and powerful. Now, of course, these types of castles are real, legitimate, historical castles, but what if I told you that they only represent the minority of what real historical castles were like? When people try to define or even identify a structure as a castle, they usually think of a large, impressive stone structure with many battlements and defences. Castles like Dover, Carnarvon, Roch-Tilliard, the Crac de Chevalier, Malbork, Bodiam, Ludlow. They even think of fortified cities and communes like Mont Saint-Michel or Carcassonne. Even structures that have no real defensive battlements on them at all, like Neuschwanstein or Balmoral Castle. Even Windsor Castle, though it has more historical roots than others, is not properly fortified at all like historical castles were meant to be. There are literally hundreds, and I mean hundreds of examples, whether they are neo-Gothic recreations with no real defensive battlements, or the real historical structures, some in much better condition and some in a large amount of decay. There were a lot of castles built in history, and those castles that survive today in either ruins or still standing proud does not begin to reflect the true number that have existed. Larger castles made of stone have a much greater chance of surviving the decay of time than others, and it's the others that I want to talk about in this video, because they actually outnumber these larger and grander castles by a large amount. What are these types of castles like? Well, you have to understand that most people that needed a functioning castle and were allowed to build them were not as rich as the greater earls, counts, or kings of the time. They could not build such huge, impressive stone castles. Rather, they had to work within their own resources. And if that meant fortifying their own manor, well, that's exactly what they did. Now, they could have fortified a pre-existing structure or picked a more suitable location for their new home, but it was very much the limitation of resources and their wealth that would determine the type of castle that they were able to build. And more often than not, that castle would have been made out of wood. That might seem rather odd, especially considering that most of the castles people see in the world, the surviving ones, are all made out of stone. So how do we know that most castles are actually made out of wood? Well, written records. Now, I do need to define what I mean by most, because I'm not trying to imply that 90% of all historical castles ever built were wood. As to the exact percentage, that is much harder to pin down. But still, all the sources I've been able to look up are very clear that most of the castles built throughout history were actually made out of wood, which means at least over 50%. As to how much over 50%, I haven't been able to find. But this does make sense because there are of course a lot more of the lesser nobles than the more wealthy, higher ranking ones, which meant that the majority of the lords who had a right and a need to build castles didn't have the resources to build big stone ones. You see, if a wooden castle was still able to fulfill the function that if a castle needed to fulfill, they could be made out of wood. And also, wood is a much cheaper, easily accessible, and moldable material than stone. How effective would a wooden castle be? Well, it really depends on what purpose it was meant to serve. You could have very large fortress-like wooden castles and very small, modest wooden castles that would be kind of hard-pressed to call a castle according to what most people's modern definitions and understandings of castles are. These smaller wooden castles wouldn't be able to hold off, say, a large army like the largest of castles were able to do, and especially the larger wooden castles would be more capable of holding off larger forces. Of course, these wooden castles, no matter their size, would have a lot more difficulty trying to withstand bombardment from large siege equipments like trebuchets, but they would be able to defend against smaller numbers of aggressors quite effectively. And even being made out of wood, there are many things that you can do to prevent it from being able to be set on fire, or at least set on fire with any amount of ease. And for protecting the food stores of the local area and against the small brigand, thief, bandit, or even moderate size of raiders, these wooden castles would be perfectly fit for purpose. Unfortunately, it's very hard to determine what these more common types of castles were like because basically none have survived. Of course, being made out of wood and wood rots, there's our problem. But as I mentioned before, it's very likely they came in two kind of flavors depending on size, and most of them would have actually been far smaller and modest than you might think. Indeed, the best kind of sub-classification we could give these types of castles would be a fortified manor house, and I'm going to focus on them just a little bit right now. The closest historical example from real surviving historical castles that I've been able to find, and if you've found a better example than this, please let me know, is Stokes E Castle. Now, what you'll notice about Stokes E is that it is predominantly made out of stone with, of course, some timber structures as well. But because a lot of it is stone, that doesn't really make it a perfect representation of what these timber castles would have been like. But having said that, a lot of these, timber castles would have had parts made out of stone as they tried to upgrade them, which I'll talk a bit about later. But still, we are very lucky to have this castle still standing as a representation of what kind of the higher end of what these fortified manor houses were like. But still, with it being kind of on the higher end, you can still see it seems to be very much sitting in the middle between a full big stone castle and a wooden fortified manor house, especially with this big stone tower off to its side. So with Stokes E, other references, we can try and speculate what these castles are like, and this 3D model that I've made here is just one example of what the most modest type of castle might have looked like historically. But aside from needing to speculate on how they were constructed and what they looked like, what we do know is that there was a lot of them. Because you have to remember, a castle is a status symbol. Any lordling, whatever his status, right? If he could say he had a castle, and in fact he would want to call his home a castle, they would try and build that and pass off whatever place they were living in as a castle, but of course they would want the function out of it as well, so they would try and make it as defensible as possible. And once it was defended and fortified enough, and was fulfilling the role that medieval castles fulfilled, well then it became a castle. An interesting standard that actually existed in the medieval period to determine if a home was actually a castle or properly fortified would be if it was crenellated. Now, there's actually historical precedent for us understanding this concept, that crenellations were very much a large determining kind of point of reference for people to consider a manor house a castle over just being a regular house. And it is that there was actually a license to crenellate a structure in the medieval period. You couldn't do it legally without permission. The interesting thing is there is actually a larger amount of identified castle locations. Not all of them have castles on them, but because of records we know there was a castle here, or of course a mound artificially built generally will mean there was either a motte and bailey or a castle structure on that mound. There is a larger amount of these locations than there are recorded licenses to crenellate. Maybe we just don't have all the records of the licenses to crenellates that were issued in the past, or it wasn't fully enforced. But the fact that we do know licenses to crenellate existed means that some measure of regulation was attempted. This isn't the only example of regulation of castle construction that existed in history. A lesser lord who received the right to build a castle but didn't have the resources to, try and build something out of stone brand new, and instead chose to fortify his current residence by adding crenellations and either walling off its exterior walls or adding a wall to create an internal bailey, most likely then worked at improving and upgrading portions at a time, adding a tower in one section or pulling down the wooden wall to add a stone wall, adding a gatehouse, upgrading the manor house, and even though that manor house would have been considered the keep of this castle, make it an actual fortified stone keep. And bit by bit, this lower lord might actually get there to have something that would be an impressive castle. Because not all castles were actually impressive. There were some pretty hopeless attempts. But if a lord lived in it, and it had some measure of crenellations and fortifications on it, it was a legitimate medieval castle. The interesting thing about adding crenellations to a building to then convert it into a castle, this concept actually continued beyond the time when castles were still employed for actual military defense. It didn't take long, even in the medieval period itself, for castles to become important status symbols, and when their use became obsolete, that symbol of status was still there. So adding crenellations to a building, even crenellations that served no functional purpose apart from looking like crenellations, was still regulated to an extent because you needed to be of a certain social station to be able to put that on your home to get this status symbol. Of course, nowadays there's no regulation on it at all, and anyone is free to make a home look somewhat castle-like. It's just important to remember that crenellations once served a legitimate functional purpose, and in the medieval period, if they had fake crenellations on a building, the people would have looked at it and known that this is a really pathetic attempt at someone trying to say they've got a fancy castle, when no, they really don't. Unless it was properly fortified and was able to function as a castle was supposed to, the medieval people would not have considered it a castle in that time, even though later on this concept has changed. Even in the late medieval period and perhaps Renaissance era, people would consider buildings that looked like castles as castles even if they couldn't fulfill the functional purpose for them, because castles didn't have a functional purpose anymore eventually. They still served a bit in the Renaissance period, but it's only much later when heavy cannons and stuff. But even then, fortresses had a measure of function with cannon fire, but of course now towards the modern day, castles don't have a military purpose anymore. So you could say in the medieval period, a castle was defined according to its function, not necessarily its appearance, whereas in the modern day, castles are more often defined by their appearance rather than their function. And there were a lot of wooden fortresses and wooden fortified manor houses, both of which are castles in the medieval period. Indeed, what you have to remember is that these wooden castles actually outnumbered the stone castles. So, in summary, the most common type of historical medieval castle was actually far different to what most surviving castles look like today. And they have largely been overlooked by historians and indeed even myself so far on this channel. One of the issues is because so little is actually known of them, and we have such a small amount of archaeological evidence for them. They really are the forgotten castles of history. Thank you for watching, I hope to see you again, and until then, farewell.